Educational programming centered around specific ethnic and racial experiences. My son is in a public school. He takes a class called African American History. If you're running an African American history class, could you perhaps be in violation of this court order, of this executive order?
I'm not quite certain, and I'd like to look into it further and get back to you on that.
So there's a possibility. There's a possibility, you're saying, that public schools that run African American history classes, right? This is a class that has been taught in public schools for decades, could lose federal funding if they continue to teach African American history.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I would like to take a look at these programs and fully understand the breadth of the executive order and get back to you on that.
I think you're going to have a lot of educators and a lot of principals and administrators scrambling right now.
This is where we are. It was a chilling moment. It happened today in the confirmation hearing for Donald Trump's pick to lead the Department of Education. That was the former World Wrestling Entertainment CEO, Linda McMahon, leaving the door open today for schools to lose federal funding for teaching American history. It's just the latest attack on education and history and diversity in schools. Earlier this month, NBC News reported that Education Department employees were placed on leave after taking diversity training during Trump's first term. Our friend and colleague Alex Wagner sat down with one of the employees impacted.
I just made sure that the trainings were 508 compliant, meaning people with disabilities would be able to view the presentations without any issues, and that I provided transcripts, made sure captions were on, and things of that nature. Also making sure that there weren't any sudden flashing pictures for people who may be prone to epilepsy or seizures. That's what I was concerned about, accessibility.
That's what accessibility is. Joining me at the table is my colleague and friend, MSNBC anchor Alex Wagner, host of the new podcast, Trumpland. I feel like what you bring back gets darker every week.
Yeah, I mean, the breadth of this gutting of the federal government is staggering once you get to the actual employees, right? There are two things that really stood out to me about that woman's experience. One, she took and participated in these trainings under the Trump administration, right? What is more Orwellian than the government saying you should take these trainings, then taking them, and then being targeted and put on administrative leave because you took them, as in the second administration, right? So there's that piece of it. But I thought it was so important to hear about what the controversial sort of woke agenda she was part of is. It's putting closed captionings on training sessions, making sure that epileptics don't have seizures because they're flashing lights. I mean, in what world is that part of a divisive woke agenda that's splitting the country into? I mean, this is just practical measures that are taken to make sure that people with disabilities can participate in the world. I mean, I don't imagine that most Americans would take issue with that in the way that Chris Murphy is right to highlight African-American history. That's not part of a woke liberal agenda. That's teaching, as you say, American history. And yet these are the changes that are being made by the Trump administration and the DOJ team.
Well, and Trump quotes Martin Luther King in his inaugural address. So are we erasing all that?
Well, what's interesting about the McMahon hearing is at one point she's asked a question about whether the legacy and history of Martin Luther King can be taught in schools. And she sort of dismisses it as, oh, well, of course. I mean, I believe in Martin Luther King, who has now become, of interest to the right as they talk about a colorblind society, ironically, I would say. But the fact is, it is not a big leap to go from not teaching African-American history to no longer teaching Martin Luther King. And the door, regardless of what any of these people say in their confirmation hearings, the door is open.
What else did you hear?
So one of the things that I think it's really important as we talk about what this DEIA stuff is to put it in the proper historical context. Some of these employees who I believe have been wrongly placed on administrative leave by the Trump administration at the Department of Education have sought legal counsel. And I spoke with one of the lawyers who's representing a number of these employees. His name is Subodh Chandra, and this is for the podcast. He had, I think, probably the most essential understanding of what Trump is really trying to do here. So let's take a listen to what he had to say.
It's almost a perversion of language where they are trying to demonize something that at the end of the day is just anti-discrimination activity. That's what it is. It's people who were participating on a committee to ensure that the department doesn't discriminate in hiring, promotions, assignments, how people are treated. And there's just nothing inherently wrong with that unless you're a white supremacist, or a Nazi. So it's bizarre, and my contention is that it violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars discrimination in employment and bars retaliation against people for opposing discrimination in employment.
This is where this is all going.
This
is going to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As part of the podcast, I interviewed Chris Rufo, who is Trump's, I think, consigliere, if not in an official capacity, in a substantive one on all this anti-woke stuff. And he takes issue with the scope and the breadth of the 1964 Civil Rights Act as it is practiced now. He thinks it has been used as a tool for liberal overreach. It has been used to justify racial preferences, which is what he calls, anti-discrimination efforts in another name. But I think that's where we're headed on this, right? What kind of society we want, whether the sort of civil rights progress of the last half century is a direction we continue moving towards, or whether we literally try to roll back the clock on this. And I believe that the right-wing, generals who are in charge of this movement absolutely intend on taking the civil rights law of 1964 back to the Supreme Court and seeing how the chips fall.
It's unbelievable.